Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics, and this is the Holosun Optics 508T version 2. It's rare in this day and age to see a company release a second version of a product that had just recently come out. Sometimes that's because of in-production problems. They identify shortcomings or issues with the manufacturer, the design, something that engineers just couldn't account for, and they have to make a rolling change or a complete change whatsoever. That's not necessarily the case, as I found out when I got the version 2. The first thing you'll notice, of course, about the version 2 over the version 1 is the body is definitely a different shape. It takes a different battery, and the buttons, the actual adjustment buttons on the side, are placed in a more, I'd say, reasonable place over the previous version. Although with the 508, the original 508, I didn't have any issues with it. So I was a little confused initially as to why a second version came out so quickly, because if you remember from my review of the 508T, I had really good things to say about it, and throughout that 2,000 round initial evaluation process, I wasn't able to develop any consistent problems with it. I wasn't able to completely crack the glass. Had a little bit of delamination, but no real cracking. And it handled the burn down fine. It maintained 0 through all the drop testing. So when the 508T version 2 came out, I was like, great, now I have to kind of set my 508 version 1s aside, because they're eventually not going to be available anymore, and start evaluation on the brand new version 2. So that's exactly what I did. I got into my evaluation process with the newer version 2 to see if the changes were cosmetic or actually an advantage and an improvement upon the version 1. As far as specifications, features go on the version 2 of the 508T, you're maintaining relatively the same battery life, anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 hours. You've got dual power mode optional, a battery which instead of a 2032 now takes a side battery access 1632. It is a smaller battery, but we're still getting comparable battery life that we saw out of the 2032 on the original version 1. We still maintain those 10 daylight brightness settings and 2 night vision settings, which is huge. Having night vision capable, again, shooting a handgun under night vision, if you're going to use this on a handgun, is kind of a niche thing, but it's something I do appreciate because I do shoot a lot of night vision, including a lot of handgun with night vision. We still have that titanium body. Mounting system remains roughly the same with that RMR profile footprint. Still maintains the 1 MOA adjustments, and it weighs in just right around 2 ounces, so you're not adding a lot of bulk. And again, titanium, depending on the configuration, what it's used for, tends to sometimes be a little bit lighter than aluminum. Again, depending on how it's put together, how it's, I guess, purposed and used for the optic creation. Other features include what's now kind of a standard on Holosun is that 2 MOA dot with a 32 MOA circle reticle, which I do like a lot. Initially didn't think I was going to be a big fan of it, but as I've used the 507 to the 508, now to the 508 version 2 and the 509, I find myself really, really liking that reticle. My only complaint carrying over from the previous versions, and this isn't really a big deal, but it is something that I feel like I should bring up, is the actual adjustments. They do include a small tool that you can use to change the actual settings from shake awake to constant battery life to solar power or whatever. That same wrench is also used to make your windage and elevations adjustments, and if you lose it, you're going to be hunting around on the range for either a screwdriver or some kind of bent shell casing that you can use as a wrench in order to make those adjustments, because there aren't a lot of handy tools that you find just generally they're going to be able to have that such a small profile, unless you're coming over from like a Delta Point Pro or something like that, where you just know to have that smaller flathead. Pocket change isn't going to cut it. Handcuff key, as I found out, didn't cut it. All that works on some other optics that are out there. Not a huge issue. I just got to make sure I keep up with those little wrenches, but at this point I have enough Holosuns that I've got a bunch of those little wrenches floating around, so now I've got one on each one of my keychains just in case I do have to make adjustments. So getting into the evaluation process, first thing I did, put a good solid 25-yard zero on the 508T version 2, and then began my process. Right after I zero, pretty much commonplace is going to be that 500 round burn down. Is an accelerated rate of fire, 500 rounds as quickly as possible, because that could bring up issues that I wouldn't necessarily notice if I fired 500 rounds more pedestrian, if you will. So I want to put 500 rounds on that Burndown to see if I can create any issues whatsoever with the optic. And this particular gun is an Agency Arms 17. It's actually a Glock 17 done by Agency Arms in their field package. But I have my SOT registered auto sear, so I was able to put some faster split times on this Burndown. 500 rounds, no hiccups whatsoever. First thing I do after the Burndown is that initial drop test. We'll get to the drop testing here shortly. I also want to do one-hand manipulations. That's something that's going to come up during one-handed shooting or wounded drills or whatever. If I need to manipulate the slide during a failure to fire, a stovepipe, a double feed, something like that, that optic shelf is a great place to do it. Of course, my caveat is always do not use your optic body to manipulate the firearm unless you absolutely have to. There's other ways to go about things when you're shooting one-handed. If I need to close the slide, I don't need to rack the gun off of something. I can just use the slide release. It's that easy. Me being left-handed, I use my index finger to manipulate the slide release. I've been doing it for a long time. On ambi guns, I can use my thumb as well. And if you're shooting a Gen 5 Glock or something with ambidextrous controls, there's really no excuse whatsoever to be closing the slide off the optic. But that's just kind of my soapbox. But it's something that does have a very valuable place in situations where you do not have the ability to use the slide release because maybe you have to cycle the slide for some reason. So I do a lot of that evaluation using dummy rounds mixing with my live ammunition. It gives me some good failure to fire and some malfunction practice, as well as testing the optics durability overall to see if I can create any issues in that way. Of course, other things that are worth talking about is the actual reticle itself. I've mentioned it briefly. You have the option to turn off the circle and just use the 2 MOA dot, which is what I've been primarily doing with this one. I do appreciate that circle, and I think newer shooters who are new to red dots will appreciate it even more because it gives you a little bit more margin of error when it comes to acquiring your dot on presenting the gun, especially if you're self-teaching, because you haven't had time to attend a class where somebody can help walk you through the finer points to really good dot acquisition. I turned it off just because I'm really proficient, really used to just having a reticle. So my draw stroke, my proficiency, my press out, I don't need that 32 MOA ring, but I do still appreciate it. Reticle is clean, has a really fast refresh rate, so if I'm transitioning quickly from target to target, I don't get that segmented blinking that you see on some of the less inexpensive, or I should say the more inexpensive and or cheaper optics that are out there. Some people say refresh rate isn't a big deal. Maybe not shooting steel, but if I'm tracking a mover, like real life situation, I don't want a sight picture to blink on me. I want a constant sight picture like I'm tracking a front sight post, only new and improved because I'm target focused. So I don't want my reticle to ever blink or get weird on me when I'm moving quickly. And if you're curious about refresh rate, the best way to describe it is buy a cheap laser pointer and just do this against the wall. You should, if it has a high refresh rate, you'll just get a solid red beam like you see on high-end lambs. What you're likely to see with that cheap laser pointer is dashes. Perforated lines, whatever you want to call them. That's because the refresh rate sucks. And then you can also have that in optics, but that's not the case with the Holosun. Those 10 brightness settings you have for daylight are great. I like the fact that I set it on a setting and I leave it there. Now, it's got a couple different operation modes. You can leave it in just standard solar/battery. You can put it in shake awake. You can turn shake awake off, or you can put it in constant on, battery constant on, which is exactly what I do. With this particular one, I leave it on setting 7, which is going to give me close to 50,000 hours of battery life. Setting 6 is where they quote for 50,000 hours. So going up one, I do lose a little bit of 50,000 hours, but if you do the math on 50,000 hours, I'm pretty comfortable leaving it on year round and every year, just like I do with every other optic I have. Change the battery on my birthday, easy date to remember. The body is now, well, square. I've got a square. One of the concerns that people brought up, and I think this is just more of a perspective thing, is does that reduce the size of the window from the version 1? The answer to that is no, it does not. I actually like the square body a lot. I was initially apprehensive because 90-degree angles tend to not take force very well if dropped directly on them. That's why you don't see a lot of square rifle suppressors. You don't want a lot of high pressure going into being able to deliver into that angle, and the inverse is somewhat a little less true because triangles tend to be the strongest geometric shape that you can produce for load bearing. At least that's what I understand. I am a layman when it comes to architecture, of course, and engineering as well. The side access battery tray is brilliant. That's one of the biggest concerns that a lot of people have, is they don't want to have to remove the optic from the handgun in order to change the battery. Now you don't have to. You got a little battery tray option. The recessed and removed buttons, I think, are a big advantage. I think this is something that was only possible because they went to the more square design shroud, being able to move those buttons up there, because usually on those rounded shrouds you don't have a lot of real estate to start putting stuff on there. As far as impact goes, going back to the overall shape, I wasn't getting I don't have a lot of surface area here to prevent direct impact onto the solar panel, onto the edges, but the lens is very nicely recessed all the way around on the front of the optic, so that's going to lend itself very, very well, conceivably, to not only drop testing, but also one-handed manipulations, which are two parts of my continuing evaluation process on almost every handgun optic that's out there. Reticle behaved exactly like I'd want it to behave shooting under night vision. Also shooting in low light, which is probably something that the average shooter is probably going to be a little bit more concerned with. A lot of optics out there that do well under ideal lighting conditions, and they just don't perform very well at all when you put them in a low light environment and you have to push a weapon light down range or use a handheld or whatever your technique is. So I was very pleased, and I didn't expect anything different coming over from the 508 version 1 to the 508 version 2. Still have that same crisp, concise reticle performance under low light, using white light, handheld light, weapon mounted light, and transitioning, going to those night vision settings to shoot under night vision. You can shoot under night vision, no problem whatsoever, using the 2 MOA dot and leave the circle on. I do like it a little better, turning that circle reticle off and just using that 2 MOA dot. I have a little less bloom, a little less halo, a little more perception, and a little less of my target is covered by my reticle, because of course night vision magnifies light. Same thing's going to happen even with a night vision setting on the optic. I'm still able to do exactly what I need to do, see exactly what I need to see. And the night vision settings lend themselves very, very well to exactly what they're for, which is shooting under night vision. Of course, the elephant in the room, most controversial thing I do, the drop test. I drop the gun, the optic, whatever optic I'm evaluating, every 500 rounds to give a somewhat consistent, although not scientific, consensus of how well the optic is going to handle shock. This doesn't necessarily mean someone is going to drop their gun. It's a consistent, because I stay the same height, drop it from shoulder height. I know it's not scientific, it's not crane. However, this is a sample size of 1. In the event that this optic breaks during the drop testing, yeah, I go get another one. And you know, once I've gone through 4 or 5 or 6 optics, depending, I'll reach a consensus either way. But the whole point of the drop test is just to load that gun. It's not necessarily saying, like I said, you're going to drop the gun, but I've already had reports from some of my students using some other optics who've had them in duty holsters, gotten into a fight, rolled around on concrete or pavement, asphalt in a parking lot, and had their optic break just by body weight going across the top of it. So that's the whole reason I do the drop testing. And me personally, you got to put your goalpost somewhere, so I would rather carry an optic that can handle the drop test versus making excuses for one that can't. Of course, the final caveat, not really germane to the video, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, is this is my testing protocol for duty carry optics. Optics that I would consider for hard use concealed carry, if that's what you want, or for law enforcement, self-defense purposes, open carry, duty carry, patrol carry, not necessarily CCW, because there's some optics that would do really, really well as just an everyday concealed carry optic, but I wouldn't recommend them for a duty gun at all. So 1 drop every 500 rounds, here's your drop test. So after 2,000 rounds, 4 shoulder height drop tests, I have no damage whatsoever to the lens except from some cosmetic marring to the body. Now the real question is, okay, yeah, the glass didn't break, that's great. Did it maintain 0? This is another concern that we need to have. Do we have confidence in our optic if we drop it that it's going to maintain 0? So just to get that out of the way, here's the first 5-round group I shot for confirmation on my 0 right after mounting the optic. And here's a 5-round group fired right after the final drop test. And that is 0 maintained after those 4 shoulder height drop tests. Now keep in mind, this is part of an evaluation process. So I do videos at 2,000 rounds just because that's become my standard for the review of almost anything. However, it will have an ongoing evaluation. If and when it makes it to 10,000 rounds, I'll probably do an update video. I don't do that on every optic because I just don't have time to film every single optic I'm evaluating. But I'll probably give you guys an update on this one because I see this becoming a very popular optic. Like I said initially, I didn't see a desperate need for changes to the version 1. However, after spending 2,000 rounds, a little bit over 2,000 rounds now at the time of filming this video, I get it. I understand why they made the changes they want, and it was a very, very fast pivot based on feedback they got from the market and from other shooters. So I was glad Holosun sent this out to me for me to check out why the changes were made and if they were really necessary. The 508T version 1 was in no desperate need for updates. However, the updates are very, very welcome. I like the design change, I like the shroud, I like the battery placements, and I like the button placements, and I like the fact that now one less issue that people have to contend with in the event that you did have to replace a battery on a Holosun within 3 or 4 years. Now I have a side axis battery tray. Those battery changes can be made very, very quickly. Everything else as far as rigidity, performance, durability, reticle, everything else remains just the same. I love the settings, I love the features, I love the reticle options, and I love the overall performance. So if you were on the fence about getting a 508 version 1 and you may be able to find one on sale now, you can have a lot of confidence in that, or you can purchase the new and improved version 2, and I got a lot of confidence in this optic. I would personally carry it. I've started to introduce more Holosuns into my life, if you will. Not only as offset optics on rifles, but also on guns. In fact, one of my Sage guns that I do regularly carry, the Sage Edition gun from HC Arms, has a Holosun 508 version 1 on it, which I'm very happy with. I have a lot of confidence in. So if you're interested, or you were on the fence about Holosun and you're looking at a pistol optic from them, you can't go wrong with the 508T version 2. I'm Eric Allen with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.